So, Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about swords. In particular, I want to talk about sword hilt design and how it may have informed how the swords were used historically. A lot of times we don't have to guess at this. If you look at more modern swords, um, let's say from the medieval period onwards, the middle of the medieval period, you typically have treatises, sword fighting manuals, etc. You have them for sword and buckler, you have them for longsword, you have them for side sword, rapier, all the way through modern military saber in the 19th century. But prior to I-33's sword and buckler manual, there's really nothing that survives. I'm sure there was stuff written down. I'm sure there were also systems of fighting that people just knew and taught each other and maybe never bothered to really write down. But they don't survive to this day. So there's nothing really written down about how earlier period swords were used. We just have some drawings, pictures, tapestries, possibly embellished or fictionalized histories or accounts, that sort of thing. And in particular, a sword like this, there is a question of how it was used. This is the Hanwei reproduction. They call it a Norman sword. Where this type of thing would have sat historically would be between the Viking era swords with their characteristic eye-shaped hilts and short grips, and the later medieval swords, which would have had a Brazil nut pommel or even a rounded wheel pommel. And those you see, the wheel pommel in particular, you see in the I-33 manuscript. As far as this type of sword is concerned, and swords from this era, there's nothing really written down about how they were used. So I'm sitting here and I'm wondering. Now, disclaimer, I'm not a historian, archaeologist, or professional fencer. Somebody who's just into this stuff, and I have taken some longsword classes. That's, okay, disclaimer over. But I'm looking at this and I'm trying to figure out, okay, a lot of times you can look at how something is shaped and it'll tell you how it may have been used. Right? And we kind of have to do this with these because there is no, like I said, there's no surviving sword manual that goes back to this time period. Now, if you look at this hilt, in particular the pommel, it seems designed to do two things. It seems designed to be limiting, but at the same time allow you to bypass that limitation. You'll notice in general shape, it's curved on the top. It's much more curved on the bottom. And the top part is flat and has fairly distinct corners and edges. However, the rest of it doesn't. It's rounded. It's domed on the sides. It sort of tapers down like this. And again, it's very round and rounded off and smooth. Now this, when you're swinging the sword, this does provide a little more mobility than a typical Viking era hilt. Two reasons. One, the grip is slightly longer. So the hand isn't as jammed in there. Viking era swords have notoriously short grips. Secondly, the pommel is curved. Now, some Viking era swords had slightly curved pommels or even cross guards, but this is much more curved, I would argue, or at least a little bit more curved. It definitely looks more curved. And combined with a slightly longer grip, it's not much longer, but that much longer, it does give you more mobility a little bit with the sword than a Viking era hilt might. But here's the thing: it still controls your hand. If you were to swing the sword, this bottoms out against the heel of your hand right there. Now what this does is it keeps you from swinging past basically horizontal. So it stops your hand where your blade is more or less still pointed at the enemy. If I was facing another swordsman, if you were to overswing with one of these, now your blade's pointed at the ground. You've given your enemy an opening. Even with the large shields these were often used with. You've given him an opening that there's no reason to. Your point is offline. Your blade is pointed at the ground where it's harmless, essentially. So one could argue that the constricting motion of this, that this was intended to keep you from extending too far, either to keep you from extending your hand past the cone of protection created by the angulation of your large shield that you would typically be using one of these with, or to keep you from overswinging so that, I got to be careful of all this stuff here, but so that the blade is not, again, offline, pointed at the ground, giving the other guy an opening. So either to keep your hand protected behind your shield, and not extending it too far, or to keep yourself from giving the other guy an opening by having your swing go too far and point at the ground. Now, here's the thing, though. Oh, and there's one more thing, in that overswinging is bad for the arm. I don't know how much they knew this back then, but one can assume they did. If you overswing too much, you get what's like tennis elbow. I guess we could call it swordsman's elbow. Just something I've noticed. Now, here's a thought, right? Okay, you can see that this hits the back of your hand, and it's uncomfortable. It stops you from swinging too far. But you also notice that sometimes you can let it slide past. In fact, if you look at the way this is domed here like this, it almost seems designed to fit into that crook of your hand right there. So that when you let it slide past, it rests naturally in that spot. Huh, interesting. Okay, so on one hand, it seems designed to limit how far you can strike with the blade and how far you can extend by having this bottom out against the heel of your hand. But on the other hand, it seems designed to allow you to bypass that if you wish, by having this rounded like that. One could say, well, maybe they rounded the top part but not the inside, because when it's in a scabbard, it's going to be rubbing on your clothes, and maybe. But then why not round the inside where they have these corners? I mean, if you're worried about something chafing against your torso, which is going to be protected by layers of clothing, certainly you should be just as worried about it chafing against your hand, which, may be open, right, and in direct contact with it. I would think so. But instead, we have this, it bottoms out against the hand. That seems to be the purpose of that. In fact, I would argue maybe these also had a secondary job of actually keeping the sword from, sliding out of the hand in that sense. But certainly what it does is it stops you from swinging too far. The corner digs into your hand. But it allows you to bypass that. Again, because it's rounded like this on the sides, and it fits nicely into the palm of your hand, it's easier to slip past that than it would be something that was squared off. It's almost designed to allow it to slip past the hand like that. The question then becomes, why would they have a hilt design that's limiting in as much as it stops you from swinging too far by bottoming out against your hand, but at the same time have the same hilt design allow you to bypass that limitation? And I would, again, this is just me speculating here, but I would argue that it has perhaps to do with the fact that there are different modes of combat. In particular, in this time period, on foot and mounted, right? If you're on foot and you overswing, it's going to maybe allow your hand to go out past the protection of your shield and get sniped. It may allow you to have your point, offline, pointed at the ground instead of towards the opponent, giving him an opening, etc. But there are times when you may need to overswing. For example, if you're up on a horse and you want to hit some guy on the ground and your sword stops right here, well, that's no help, right? So what do? I mean, I guess you could just switch the sword around and go, ah, ah, ah. But realistically, what are you going to do, right? Well, you allow it to slide past the hand. So I honestly think that these two almost contradictory aspects of this pommel design for this type of hilt are indicative of the two ways in which the weapon may have been used. On foot, it prevents an overswing, keeps your point on line, keeps your hand from going out past the protection of your shield, keeps you from getting swordsman's elbow. On horseback, it allows you to overextend to get the reach to hit somebody who might, let's say, be on the ground, threatening to spear you or your horse, or coming after you with a Dane axe or some big old thing. Now, again, this is just my speculation. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not a historian. I just, like everybody else who's interested in these things, I have noted that there are no written treatises for swords going back this far in time. So I'm looking at the sword and I'm saying to myself, this pommel design is peculiar. It's peculiar from what came earlier, and it's peculiar from what came later. And I got to wonder if there's a reason for that. That it's intended to prevent you from overswinging, but it also allows you to bypass that. And then I make the logical, I don't say logical leap, but I think, well, why would they have a limiting hilt design but allow you to bypass that limit? Well, because not all combat's on foot. You may need to overswing if you're up on a horse, for example, and you want to hit somebody on the ground. Well, there you go. That becomes a benefit. So, and again, this is just my theory here, but the design seems to be intended to, like the earlier Viking style hilts, limit your ability to overswing, presumably for a good reason. Again, keep your point on line, don't allow your hand to get lopped off by going past your shield, prevent strain on the arm, etc. May also be to enforce a certain type of cutting style. I don't know. But then you have the fact that you can bypass that. And again, why would you need to bypass that? Well, if you're in a different situation, right? You can allow it to slip past the hand easier. So just my my 2 cents on that. And one of the things it is worth noting, I guess, is that when you get into sword and buckler fighting, and then ultimately periods when swords were often used without shields, or sometimes used without shields. So later on in the Middle Ages, you find the pommels get less and less restricting. First, they go into a Brazil nut, where these corners are further away and more curved away from the hand, and often rounded. And then you go to a wheel pommel, where it's completely rounded, and they did away with the 2 corners entirely. Later on, you get so-called sense stopper pommels and more elongated pommels that actually give you even more freedom of hand movement. So, it is worth noting that these things changed over time, and how much of that is, again, the fact that it was used with a large shield. When you get more towards things like bucklers, which are smaller than shields, the sword is more mobile. It's moving around in conjunction with the buckler, and the pommel gets less constricting. Surprise! And then when you get to the point where swords are being used, without shields, largely due to the prevalence of armor, or sometimes without shields at least, you find, again, less constricting pommels. So, just some thoughts there. Again, I have no idea if this is correct, but nobody does, because they never wrote this stuff down, or it didn't survive. Like I said, we don't have any sword treatises going back before I-33. But I think it's a good bet that because this is limiting in terms of how far you can swing the sword, how much of an arc you can describe, but at the same time it allows you to bypass that limit, I would argue that there is a reason for that. And I can't think of a better reason than the fact that you could be engaged in combat in 2 situations. On foot, where it's important to keep your blade on line with your opponent and protect your sword arm behind your shield and all of that jazz. And on horseback, where you may be fighting people who are on foot and you may need to overextend. So there we go. Lone Rider out, and just some thoughts on the the implications sword hilt design has for sword use, and in particular this so-called Norman hilt. There you go. Lone Rider out.